25 million people, 600 soldiers, 80 years. By the time it was over, 24 million were dead. Not from war, not from swords, not from cannons. From something no one on either side could see. November 8, 1519, the Great Causeway of Tenochtitlan, central Mexico. On this morning, the most powerful ruler in the Western Hemisphere stood waiting at the entrance to the greatest city most Europeans would ever see. He wore a diadem of turquoise and gold. Attendants had laid cloths along the stone causeway so that his sandals would not touch the bare ground. Thousands of his subjects lined the water's edge in silence, watching, waiting, not yet afraid. Across from him, a man with 600 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons walked forward to shake his hand. The air smelled of copal incense drifting from temple fires. Flowers had been scattered along the causeway stones. Lake Texcoco stretched out in every direction, flat and silver in the morning light. It looked like a welcome. It was the beginning of the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. What no one standing on that causeway understood, not the emperor, not the conquistador, not a single soul in the watching crowd, was that the fate of 25 million people would not be decided by steel swords or gunpowder or horses or military genius. It would be decided by three things. First, by an empire that had spent a century making enemies of every neighbor it had. 400 city-states, paying tribute in gold, in grain, in human lives. 400 city-states seething under the weight of that extraction, waiting for someone, anyone, to give them a chance to fight back. Second, by a single decision made on this very causeway, a decision to open the gates rather than close them, to welcome the stranger rather than destroy him, a decision rooted in religious uncertainty, in diplomatic calculation, in a worldview that could not comprehend what was walking through the door. And third, by passengers no one knew were coming, microscopic organisms riding in the blood of Spanish soldiers, pathogens that had never existed in this hemisphere, diseases against which 25 million people had exactly zero immunity, not partial immunity, not weakened immunity, zero. The swords would kill thousands, the alliances would kill tens of thousands, the diseases would kill millions. This is not the story you were taught in school, a small band of brave conquistadors overthrowing a savage empire of human sacrificers. That is the version the conquerors wrote. It served their purposes. It justified what they did, and it erased the humanity of 25 million people in the process. This is a different story. This is the story of how empires contain the seeds of their own destruction. How the very systems that build power, tribute, fear, ritual warfare, create the resentments that tear it down. How an isolated civilization met pathogens it never knew existed, carried by men it never asked to come. And how 25 million individual human lives, artists, farmers, mothers, priests, children, astronomers, healers, poets, became a historical footnote. Their languages, their knowledge, their stories erased not by swords but by microscopic invaders they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't understand. By minute 10, you'll understand why the Aztec Empire's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness, and why 200,000 indigenous warriors fought alongside the Spanish, not against them. By minute 20, you'll witness the decision that sealed the empire's fate and the massacre that made its destruction inevitable. And by the end, you'll know what really killed 24 million people, and what was lost with them that we will never recover. But first, you need to understand what Hernán Cortés walked into that November morning. You need to see the world that existed before it was destroyed. You need to see the city. Because the city is where this story begins, and the city is what makes this story a tragedy. In 1519, the largest city in Spain was Seville, population roughly 60,000. London had about 50,000. Paris, perhaps 200,000 on a generous count. Tenochtitlan had 300,000. Let that register for a moment. The capital of the Aztec Empire was larger than any city in Europe, and it was built on an island in the middle of a lake. 7,300 feet above sea level, ringed by volcanic mountains capped with snow. Lake Texcoco spread out around the island like a mirror, and from it, the city rose, white stone and painted plaster, terraced gardens, the smoke of 10,000 cooking fires drifting upward into thin mountain air. 3 massive stone causeways connected the island to the shore, each one wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. Fresh water flowed in through twin aqueducts from the springs at Chapultepec, 3 miles to the west. Waste was carried away by canoe, collected systematically, transported to the mainland, and used as fertilizer on the floating gardens that ringed the city's edges. The city had a zoo, the first in the Americas. Jaguars paced behind wooden barriers, eagles sat hooded on perches, rattlesnakes coiled in stone enclosures. 300 keepers tended an aviary housing hundreds of species of birds, quetzals, macaws, herons, their feathers more valuable in this economy than gold. At the great marketplace of Tlatelolco in the northern district, 60,000 people traded daily. You could buy obsidian blades sharper than surgical steel, jaguar pelts, vanilla, cacao, tobacco, rubber, gold dust carried in transparent quills, turquoise mosaics, slaves, live eagles, everything organized by category, a section for food, a section for cloth, a section for pottery, a section for medicines. Judges patrolled the aisles settling disputes on the spot. And at the center of it all, dominating the skyline, rising 147 feet into the air, taller than a 12-story building, stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. Twin shrines at its summit, one to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, one to Tlaloc, the god of rain. The plaster walls were painted in deep blues and reds. Serpent heads carved from stone jutted from the base. The steps were steep and narrow, designed so that bodies thrown from the summit would tumble all the way to the bottom. The drums on that temple could be heard for miles. When Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's foot soldiers, a man who would later write the most vivid eyewitness account of the conquest, when he first saw Tenochtitlan from the mountain pass above, he wrote something extraordinary. He said, "We were astounded. These great towns and temples and buildings rising from the water, all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not all a dream." It was not a dream. It was the capital of the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere, a city of engineers, of merchants, of poets, of priests. And it was about to be destroyed. The wealth of Tenochtitlan did not come from nowhere. The Aztec Empire, more accurately called the Triple Alliance, a coalition of 3 city-states, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, was not an empire of administration. It was not like Rome, building roads and aqueducts into conquered territory, installing governors, integrating subject peoples into a common system. The Aztecs did not integrate. They extracted. Over 400 city-states paid annual tribute to Tenochtitlan. We know exactly what they paid because the records survived. The Codex Mendoza, compiled shortly after the conquest on European paper but in the Aztec pictographic style, lists the payments in meticulous detail. 7,800 bales of cotton cloth annually, 480 feathered warrior costumes, each one requiring months of skilled labor, bins of cacao beans, baskets of chili peppers, loads of raw rubber, sheets of bark paper, blocks of amber, bags of cochineal dye, live eagles in wooden cages. And people. The tribute system demanded prisoners for sacrifice, not as an aberration, not as an occasional excess, as a structural requirement. The flower wars, Xochitl, were the mechanism. Ritualized battles, arranged in advance between Aztec forces and neighboring states, designed not to conquer territory but to capture prisoners. Warriors on both sides fought to take their opponents alive, grappling on the battlefield, dragging captives back across the lines. The prisoners were brought to Tenochtitlan, marched up the steps of the great temple, held down across a stone altar while a priest cut open their chests with an obsidian blade, and their still-beating hearts were torn out and offered to the sun. Their bodies were rolled down the temple steps. At the rededication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487, 32 years before Cortés arrived, the Aztecs may have sacrificed 20,000 prisoners over 4 days. The number is debated. Some scholars argue it is exaggerated. Others point to the scale of the temple and the logistical preparations as evidence that it is plausible. What is not debated is this: lines of captives stretched for miles through the streets. Multiple teams of priests worked in shifts. The steps of the temple ran with blood so thick that witnesses said the smell could be detected from across the lake. Now here is what matters for this story. Not the moral question, though that matters too, the strategic question. This system built unimaginable power. It filled Tenochtitlan with wealth. It made Moctezuma's court more opulent than most European monarchies. It fed the population. It funded the armies. It sustained the priesthood. It worked. But it also did something else. It made the Aztecs the most hated rulers in Mesoamerica. 400 city-states, paying in blood and treasure, generations of resentment, generations of fathers watching their sons dragged up those temple steps. When a stranger arrived on the coast offering an alternative, any alternative, what do you think those 400 city-states did? We'll get there, but first, you need to meet the man sitting at the top of this system. The man whose decisions in the next 12 months would determine whether the empire lived or died. Moctezuma Xaquetzin. His name meant Angry Lord the Younger. History remembers him as Moctezuma II. He was, by any measure, one of the most fascinating rulers of the pre-modern world. He became Huitzilopochtli, Great Speaker, the title we translate as emperor, in 1502 at roughly age 34. He was not born into certainty of rule. The position was not strictly hereditary. He earned it through military distinction, through religious devotion, through the support of the nobility and the priesthood. Before he became emperor, Moctezuma was a warrior of the highest rank. He had taken captives in battle with his own hands. He had proven himself on the field in the ways his culture demanded. He had climbed the steps of the temple not as a prisoner, but as a victor. But the man who emerged as ruler was not the warrior. He was the priest. Moctezuma governed through ceremony, through omen, through ritual. He consulted extensively with soothsayers and religious advisors before making any major decision. He was deeply, profoundly devout, not as performance for his subjects, but as genuine conviction. He believed the cosmos operated on cycles. He believed signs could be read in the movement of stars, in the behavior of animals, in the patterns of weather. He believed the gods spoke through nature, and that it was his sacred duty to listen. By 1519, he had ruled successfully for 17 years. He had expanded the empire's territory. He commanded tribute from millions. He ate meals served by hundreds of attendants, each dish presented behind a golden screen so that common eyes would not see the emperor chew. His food was kept warm over small braziers. Hundreds of dishes were prepared for each meal. He ate alone. No one who entered his presence could look directly at his face. No one could turn their back to him when departing. They backed away, eyes lowered. His sandals never touched the ground. Attendants laid cotton cloths before him as he walked, picking them up behind him after he passed. He was, in the understanding of his world, semi-divine, the voice of the gods on earth, untouchable, unquestionable. And then the reports began arriving from the coast. Runners, the empire's communication system, relay teams covering enormous distances on foot, brought word from the eastern provinces. Strange things had been sighted on the water: floating mountains, structures made of wood, larger than any canoe with white sheets that caught the wind, pale men with hair on their faces, animals like giant deer that carried men on their backs, thunder without clouds, fire that erupted from metal tubes and shattered trees. In 1517, the first Spanish expedition reached the Yucatan coast and was driven back by Maya warriors. Moctezuma's emissaries watched from a distance. In 1518, a second expedition sailed along the Gulf Coast. Moctezuma sent ambassadors to observe and report. The reports came back strange, incomplete, disturbing. These men did not behave like any warriors Moctezuma had encountered. They did not seem interested in captives. They did not seem to follow any recognizable diplomatic protocol. They seemed interested in one thing above all else: gold. How do you respond to something that doesn't fit any category you possess? That is the question Moctezuma faced. He was the most sophisticated political leader in the Americas, operating within a cosmological framework that had successfully explained the world for centuries. And his answer, rooted in his deepest religious convictions, shaped by a worldview that could not stretch far enough to accommodate what was coming, would destroy everything he ruled. There's one more element of the Aztec world you need to understand before we move forward, because without it, nothing that follows makes sense. The Flower Wars, those ritualized battles to capture prisoners for sacrifice, had one critical consequence that the Aztecs never resolved. A consequence that, in hindsight, reads like a civilization writing its own death sentence. For over a century, the Aztec Empire had waged flower wars against the independent city-state of Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala sat in a fertile valley east of Tenochtitlan, surrounded on all sides by Aztec tributary states. It was encircled, blockaded, cut off from trade in salt and cotton, two essentials of daily life. Its people suffered. The Aztecs could have conquered Tlaxcala. They had the numbers. They had the resources. They had the military power to overwhelm Tlaxcalan defenses and absorb the city-state into the empire. They chose not to. Tlaxcala served a purpose. It was a convenient source of prisoners for sacrifice, a permanent training ground for young warriors to prove themselves in battle, a rival whose continued existence demonstrated, year after year, the Aztec martial dominance that justified the entire system. So for 100 years the Aztecs fought Tlaxcala, raided its borders, humiliated its warriors, starved its markets, made its people suffer in a dozen small, grinding ways. But never conquered it, never absorbed it, never removed it as a threat. A century of that. In 1519, Tlaxcala could still field tens of thousands of battle-hardened warriors. Warriors who had spent 5 generations learning how to fight Aztecs. Warriors who knew Aztec tactics, Aztec weaknesses, Aztec formations. Warriors who hated the empire with a hatred that had been sharpened and refined across 100 years of raids and blockades and funerals. When Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast with 600 men, looking for allies against the most powerful empire in the Americas, Tlaxcala didn't need to be persuaded. They had been waiting. So this was the world as it stood in early 1519. An empire of extraordinary power, built on a foundation of universal resentment. A philosopher emperor who read omens in the sky and believed the cosmos would reveal its intentions if he listened carefully enough. And a 100-year enemy, undefeated, unbroken, still sharpening its blades. Into this world now comes a man with 600 soldiers, a handful of cannons, and absolutely nothing to lose. Hernán Cortés de Monter. Why Pizarro Altamirano was 34 years old when he sailed for Mexico, the same age Moctezuma had been when he became emperor. That is where the similarities end. Cortés was born in 1485 in Medellin, a small town in the Extremadura region of Spain. Extremadura, the name itself means extremely hard, was the poorest, harshest, most barren region in Castile, rocky soil, sparse rain, families that measured wealth in goats. It was also, not coincidentally, the same province that would produce Francisco Pizarro, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and Hernando de Soto, a factory of conquistadors. Men raised on stories of Reconquista glory, the 800-year campaign to drive the Moors from Spain, who understood in their bones that the only way out of poverty was through violence, cunning, and total willingness to risk everything. Cortés had studied law briefly at the University of Salamanca. 2 years. He never finished. He found academic life boring, but those 2 years gave him something more valuable than any degree, an instinct for legal technicalities, how to construct a justification, how to make the unauthorized look authorized, how to frame an act of piracy as an act of service to the crown. He would use that skill more than once. He had been in the Caribbean since 1504. 15 years. 15 years of watching other men get rich or die trying. 15 years of modest success and burning ambition on the sugar plantations and cattle ranches of Hispaniola and Cuba. He had participated in the conquest of Cuba. He had acquired land, indigenous laborers, and a reputation as a man who was competent, ambitious, and not entirely trustworthy. When Cuba's governor, Diego Velázquez, appointed him to lead an expedition to the Mexican coast in early 1519, the orders were specific and clear. Explore the coast, trade with the natives, report back, do not colonize, do not conquer, do not exceed your authority. Cortés accepted the commission. Then he spent every available hour recruiting men, buying supplies, loading ships, moving with a speed that made Velázquez nervous. The governor began to have second thoughts. He sent orders to revoke the commission. Cortés departed before the orders arrived. Some accounts say he was literally loading the last provisions onto the ships when Velázquez's messengers reached the harbor. He sailed on February 18, 1519, with 11 ships, approximately 600 men, 16 horses, and several small cannons. He was acting without authorization. He knew it. His men knew it. If he failed, he would return to Cuba in chains, if he returned at all. If he succeeded, he would bypass Velázquez entirely and present his conquests directly to King Charles as a fait accompli. For Cortés, there was no meaningful difference between those outcomes and death. All three required the same thing: total commitment. Cortés landed first on the Yucatan coast in Maya territory, where he fought brief, sharp skirmishes with local communities. The Spanish won these engagements, steel against obsidian, horses against foot soldiers, but the victories were small. What was not small was a gift he received. Among a group of slaves presented to the Spanish after one of these early battles was a young woman. The Spanish baptized her Marina. Her birth name was Melanson. History would call her La Malinche, and she would prove more valuable to Cortés than every horse, every cannon, and every sword in his entire expedition. Melanson had been born into a noble Nahuatl-speaking family somewhere in the borderlands between Aztec and Maya territory. As a child, the details are murky, but the consistent thread is cruelty. She was sold into slavery. Some sources say her own mother sold her after remarrying to secure the inheritance for a new son. She was traded to Maya merchants. She grew up as property, passed between owners, learning languages the way survivors learn, quickly, because her life depended on it. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire and its tributaries. She spoke Chontal Maya, and she learned Spanish with a speed that astonished even the conquistadors. She became Cortés's translator, then his advisor, then his consort. Through Melanson, Cortés could speak directly to Aztec emissaries. Through her, he could understand not just their words but their world, who hated whom, who could be turned, where the fractures in the empire lay and how deep they ran. Without Melanson, the conquest of Mexico would have been impossible. This is not exaggeration. This is the assessment of historians on both sides of the Atlantic. Her name would later become synonymous with betrayal in Mexican culture. Malinchismo, the preference for foreign things over one's own. The word is still used today, but Malincin was herself a product of the system she helped destroy, sold into slavery, traded as property, a woman whose own people had discarded her. She owed the Aztec Empire nothing. She owed it less than nothing. She is one of the most important figures in the history of the Americas, and almost everything about her inner life, what she thought, what she wanted, what she felt as she watched two worlds collide through words she alone could translate, is lost. In April 1519, Cortés landed at the site where he would found the city of Veracruz, named for the True Cross, because they arrived during Holy Week. He formally claimed the land for the Spanish crown, establishing a municipal government with himself as its captain general, a legal maneuver, a technicality. On paper, he was no longer acting under Velázquez's authority. He was acting under the authority of a town council that he himself had created. The 2 years at Salamanca paying off. Then he did something that has echoed through 5 centuries of military history. He ordered his ships destroyed. Some accounts say burned. Others say the hulls were deliberately holed below the waterline and the ships run aground. The details are debated. The effect was not. There would be no going back. 600 men, on a hostile coast, with no ships, 200 miles of mountains and jungle and unknown peoples between them, and a city of 300,000 that did not know they were coming. One of his men later recalled Cortés saying, "We shall conquer or we shall die. There is no third option." Whether he actually said those words hardly matters. He had just made them true. The march from the coast to Tenochtitlan covered roughly 200 miles through some of the most rugged terrain in Mexico, coastal lowlands thick with jungle and mosquitoes. Then a grinding climb through mountain passes above 10,000 feet where the air thinned and the Spanish gasped, and the horses stumbled on loose volcanic rock. Cortés took 3 months to cover that distance. He used every single one of them. First came the Totonacs, a coastal people centered around the city of Sempala who had been paying crushing tribute to the Aztec Empire. Their leader, a man the Spanish called the Fat Chief because of his size, laid out his grievances in detail. The Aztecs took their food, their cotton, their young men for sacrifice. They took and took and took, and the Totonacs were powerless to resist. Cortés listened. He promised liberation. He gained his first indigenous allies, hundreds of warriors and porters who joined his column, carrying supplies, guiding the route, providing intelligence. Then came Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans did not welcome the Spanish. They saw strangers with weapons, and they did what a century of war had taught them to do. They attacked. For 2 weeks, Tlaxcalan armies threw themselves at the Spanish column in a series of fierce engagements, open-field battles, night raids, ambushes in narrow passes. Spanish steel, horses, and cannons inflicted serious casualties, but the Tlaxcalans kept coming. They were not afraid of horses. They were not afraid of cannons. They were not afraid of dying. They had been fighting the most powerful empire in the Americas for 100 years. A few hundred pale-skinned strangers with loud weapons did not frighten them. Then something shifted, not on the battlefield, in the councils of Tlaxcalan leadership. These strangers were enemies of the Aztecs. That much was clear. Enemies of the empire that had starved Tlaxcala, blockaded its trade, humiliated its warriors, and dragged its sons up the steps of the Templo Mayor for 100 years. Whatever the Spanish wanted, gold, land, glory, it aligned with what Tlaxcala wanted. The destruction of Tenochtitlan. In September 1519, Tlaxcala became Cortés's most critical ally. At first, thousands of warriors joined the Spanish column, then tens of thousands, and ultimately, during the final siege of Tenochtitlan, over 200,000 Tlaxcalan warriors would fight alongside the Spanish. This is the fact that changes everything about how you understand this story. Everything. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not 600 Europeans defeating millions of indigenous people. It was the largest indigenous uprising in Mesoamerican history, using the Spanish as a spearhead. The Spanish provided the technology, the steel, the horses, the cannons. But the bodies, the local knowledge, the supply lines, the sheer overwhelming numbers, that was Tlaxcala. That was the Totonacs. That was dozens of tributary city-states who saw Cortés not as an invader but as a liberator. Remember those 400 tributary city-states. Cortés didn't need to defeat the Aztec Empire. He just needed to hand the empire's own enemies a weapon they'd never had before, a unifying cause, foreign military technology, and a leader ruthless enough to aim the whole thing directly at the heart of the system. The tribute system built the empire, and the tribute system built the army that would tear it down. But Cortés also showed, early and clearly, what he was willing to do to those who stood in his way. In October 1519, the Spanish entered the holy city of Cholula, the second largest city in Mexico, a major religious center, home to the Great Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. Cholula was nominally allied with the Aztec Empire. What happened there is still debated by historians 5 centuries later. Cortés claimed he had uncovered a plot. He said the Cholulans were planning to ambush his forces, that Moctezuma himself had ordered the trap. Whether the plot was real, exaggerated for propaganda purposes, or fabricated entirely remains one of the unresolvable questions of the conquest. What is not debated is the result. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies sealed the exits of the central ceremonial precinct and slaughtered between 3,000 and 6,000 Cholulans. Many of the dead were unarmed. The killing went on for hours. Temples were burned. The city was sacked. The Tlaxcalans, who had their own historical grievances against Cholula, participated with enthusiasm. The message traveled faster than Cortés's army. It reached every city between Cholula and Tenochtitlan within days. Submit, or this happens to you. When Cortés resumed his march toward the capital, no city along the route resisted. Some sent gifts. Some sent food and porters. Some sent warriors to join his growing column. Fear is a form of alliance, and Cortés understood that as well as anyone who has ever lived. During all of this, for months, Moctezuma watched. He was not passive. He was not ignorant. He was managing the crisis through the tools available to him, and those tools were formidable. He had known about the Spanish since 1517, when the first expedition under Hernández de Córdoba reached the Yucatan coast and was beaten back by Maya warriors. He had sent emissaries to observe. When a second expedition arrived in 1518 under Juan de Grijalva, Moctezuma dispatched ambassadors with explicit instructions. Watch everything, record everything, report back. When Cortés landed in 1519, Moctezuma escalated. He sent ambassadors carrying gifts of staggering richness, elaborate feathered costumes, gold ornaments worked with extraordinary skill, an entire sun disk made of solid gold as wide as a cartwheel. Alongside the gold, gifts of jade, turquoise, obsidian mirrors, cloaks of quetzal feathers. The gifts were meant to communicate power, to demonstrate that this empire possessed wealth beyond the stranger's comprehension, to suggest, diplomatically but firmly, that these visitors should take what was offered and go home. They had exactly the opposite effect. When Cortés's men saw the gold, the Aztec account, preserved in the Florentine Codex, describes it with a clarity that burns across the centuries. They seized upon the gold as if they were monkeys, their faces gleaming. For clearly their thirst for gold was insatiable. They starved for it. They lusted for it. They wanted to stuff themselves with it as if they were pigs. The gifts did not say, "Go away." To the Spanish, the gifts said, "There is more where this came from." Moctezuma tried other approaches. He sent sorcerers, priests trained in the magical arts, to cast spells that would turn the strangers back, confuse them, make them lose their way. The sorcerers failed. He sent messengers carrying offerings to the gods of the road, asking divine intervention. Nothing changed. He ordered sacrifices. The omens remained unclear. And some of his advisors, military commanders, experienced warriors, urged a different approach entirely. Destroy the strangers on the coast now before they got any closer, before they learned anything useful, before they made any alliances. Send 40,000 warriors, overwhelm them in a single day. End this. Moctezuma hesitated. Why? The traditional explanation centers on Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the most important deities in the Mesoamerican pantheon. In one version of the myth, Quetzalcoatl had departed eastward across the sea and promised to return. Cortés arrived from the east. He arrived in the Aztec calendar year 1 read, which was associated with Quetzalcoatl. The coincidence, according to this explanation, paralyzed Moctezuma with religious uncertainty. Modern historians are skeptical. The Quetzalcoatl return narrative may have been embellished or even invented wholesale after the conquest to explain and justify Moctezuma's apparent passivity. The real reasons were likely more complex and more human. Moctezuma was a sophisticated political leader. He had dealt with crises before, rebellions, famines, military setbacks, and resolved them successfully. His instinct was to gather information, to understand what he was dealing with before committing resources, to wait, observe, analyze, and then act decisively. In every previous crisis of his 17-year reign, this approach had worked. But every previous crisis had involved adversaries who operated within the same world, who fought by the same rules, who wanted the same things: captives for sacrifice, tribute, symbolic dominance. Cortés did not want captives for sacrifice. He did not want ritualized warfare. He did not want symbolic submission followed by a return to the status quo. He wanted everything: the land, the gold, the people, their souls. And Moctezuma, reading his omens and consulting his priests, reaching into the deepest wells of his cosmological understanding for guidance, could not yet see that. He had one more chance to stop what was coming, one decision that, if made differently, might have saved the empire. That decision came on November 8, 1519, on the Great Southern Causeway. And he made the wrong choice. Cortés was now marching toward Tenochtitlan with his 600 Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies. He had burned his ships. He had massacred Caligula. He had turned the empire's lifelong enemies into his own army. And Moctezuma, the most powerful man in the Americas, the semi-divine voice of the gods, had to decide: close the gates or open them. What happened next was the single most consequential meeting in the history of the Western Hemisphere. November 8, 1519, the Southern Causeway of Tenochtitlan. The morning was clear. The air at 7,000 feet was thin and bright and carried sound across the water with unsettling clarity: the slap of paddles, the murmur of the crowd, the occasional cry of a bird rising from the reeds at the lake's edge. The Spanish column approached from the south, crossing the Great Causeway from Iztapalapa, where they had spent the previous night as guests of the local lord. The causeway was built of stone and packed earth, wide enough for 8 men to walk abreast, stretching ruler straight across the open water of Lake Texcoco toward the city. To their left and right the lake, not the open ocean these men knew from the Caribbean, something stranger, more enclosed. A vast inland sea ringed by mountains, some of them snow-capped, some of them volcanic, all of them dwarfing anything in Spain. The water was flat and silver in the morning light, and it was filled with canoes, thousands of them, hollowed from single tree trunks, gliding across the surface, carrying families who had come out to watch, to see the strangers, to see what would happen next. Ahead, the city rose from the water like something from a fevered dream. White stone buildings terraced along the shoreline, rooftop gardens spilling green over the edges, temple pyramids rising above the skyline in stepped layers, their summit shrines painted in deep red and blue. smoke from cooking fires and incense burners drifting upward in thin columns. The sound of the drums, distant but unmistakable, a low, rhythmic pulse that the Spanish could feel in their chests before they could hear it with their ears. Bernal Diaz would later reach for the only comparison available to him, the chivalric romances of his youth, and write that it was like the things of enchantment they tell of in the Book of Amadis. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. These were men who had been in the Caribbean for years. They had seen tropical wonders. They had seen pyramids in the Yucatan. None of them, not one, had seen anything that compared to this. At the entrance to the city, where the causeway met the island, Moctezuma waited. He did not stand. He was carried on a litter, borne on the shoulders of nobles. The litter was covered with green quetzal feathers and gold ornaments. When he descended, attendants rushed forward to lay cotton cloths on the stone so that the emperor's sandals would not touch the bare ground. Other attendants held a canopy of green feathers and gold and jade above his head, shading him from the sun. He wore a diadem of turquoise and gold. His cloak was embroidered with precious stones. Plugs of jade hung from his ears, and a laybret of gold pierced his lower lip. He moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who had never once in his life been required to hurry. Cortés dismounted from his horse, an animal Moctezuma had never seen before that spring, an animal that did not exist in this hemisphere. The conquistador walked forward. Through Melancin, through a chain of translation that passed from Cortés's Castilian Spanish to Geronimo de Aguilar's Maya, then from Aguilar's Maya to Melancin's Nahuatl, and back again. The two most powerful men in their respective worlds spoke to each other for the first time. Moctezuma's recorded words, preserved in Nahuatl sources compiled decades later by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagun, working with indigenous informants who had been present or who carried the oral memory of those who were. I have come to your house in Mexico as a stranger. I have contemplated you for 5 days, for 10 days. Now I have seen you, have seen your face. Now I have met you. Whether these words reflected genuine welcome, or diplomatic protocol, or a formula of submission whose meaning has been distorted by colonial editors, scholars have debated for 5 centuries. Some argue the speech was rewritten after the fact to portray Moctezuma as willingly surrendering power, justifying the conquest in retrospect. Others believe it reflects a genuine, if guarded, attempt at engagement, the emperor of the known world meeting an unknown quantity and choosing, for the moment, diplomacy over war. What is not debated is the outcome. Moctezuma escorted Cortés and his men into Tenochtitlan. He housed them in the palace of Axyacatl, his father's former residence, a massive stone compound near the ceremonial center. He fed them. He assigned servants. He showed Cortés the marketplace, the temples, the aviaries, the treasury. He let them in. And that was the decision, the one from which everything else followed. Tenochtitlan was a fortress, not by accident, by design. It was built on an island. The only access was by 3 causeways, each of which could be sealed, cut, or destroyed. The city controlled the lake. Its canoe fleets could swarm any force attempting to cross the water. Its population of 300,000 could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors in hours. If Moctezuma had met the Spanish on the causeway with 200,000 warriors instead of flowers and cotton cloths and a speech about contemplation, the conquest might have ended that afternoon. 600 men against 300,000 on a narrow causeway over open water with no retreat, no ship waiting, no escape. But that is not what Moctezuma chose. He didn't see these strangers as an invasion force. He saw them as an unknown, a mystery, a problem to be observed, understood, managed, contained, perhaps used, perhaps placated, but first understood. He was the most sophisticated political leader in the Americas. He had spent 17 years managing an empire of unprecedented complexity through careful observation and calculated response. And he was wrong. Once the Spanish were inside the city, once they were behind the causeways, inside the walls, sleeping in a palace a few hundred yards from the Templo Mayor, there was no way to remove them without destroying the city itself. The causeways that had been Tenochtitlan's defense now trapped its people alongside the invaders. The city's greatest strength, its island position, had become a cage. Moctezuma had locked the door, with the enemy inside. 6 days, that was all it took. Within 6 days of entering Tenochtitlan as guests, the Spanish made their move, and the speed of it, the audacity, reveals something essential about Cortés. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for a better moment. He understood with the instinct of a predator that the moment of maximum advantage was now, while the Aztecs were still trying to understand what they were dealing with. On November 14th, 1519, Cortés marched into Moctezuma's palace with a contingent of armed soldiers and took the emperor of the Aztec Empire hostage. Not publicly, not dramatically. The seizure was dressed in the language of diplomacy, the way Cortés dressed everything, in the legal clothing that made the unjustifiable look reasonable. A pretext was offered. Aztec forces on the coast had attacked the small Spanish garrison at Veracruz. Several Spaniards had been killed. This was unacceptable. For his own safety, for the sake of the friendship between them, Moctezuma should relocate to the Spanish quarters, to the palace of Axiacatl, where Cortés could ensure his protection. Moctezuma was told it was for his own good. He was told it was temporary. He went. Why? This is one of the great riddles of the conquest. The man who commanded armies of 200,000 warriors, the man whose word could mobilize an empire, the man who was regarded as semi-divine by millions. He walked into captivity in his own capital, accompanied by his own servants, surrounded by his own soldiers, and he did not give the order to resist. Some historians argue he went willingly, that he believed he could manage the situation from within, control the Spanish through proximity, buy time while he developed a longer-term strategy. Others argue he went under implicit threat of violence, that Cortés made clear, through tone and gesture, that resistance would mean bloodshed in the palace. Others suggest that Moctezuma, operating within a framework that emphasized the importance of decorum and protocol, simply could not bring himself to initiate the kind of raw, chaotic violence that would have been necessary to kill or expel the Spanish in his own throne room. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. From November 14, 1519, forward, the emperor of the Aztec Empire was a prisoner in his own city. He continued to sit on his throne. He continued to receive tribute delegations. He continued to issue orders, but the orders now served Spanish interests. Gold was collected from the treasury. Temples were inspected. The workings of the empire, its communication systems, its military structure, its political alliances, were studied from the inside by men who were taking notes. Cortés ruled the Aztec Empire through its own emperor, a puppet arrangement, Moctezuma's face, Cortés's hand. For 6 extraordinary months, this impossible arrangement held. But it could not hold forever. The Aztec nobility understood what had happened, even if the common people did not. Warriors who had sworn oaths to protect the emperor watched foreigners give him instructions and walk freely through sacred spaces. Priests who interpreted the will of the gods, whose entire purpose was to maintain the cosmic order, saw that order violated daily. The tension built like water behind a dam. Every week the pressure increased. Every week the cracks widened. The city was a powder keg, packed tight, waiting. It needed a spark. The spark came not from Cortés. Incredibly, Cortés was not even in the city when everything collapsed. He had left Tenochtitlan to deal with a problem on the coast, a problem sent by the very governor he had defied. The man he left in charge was his second in command, a man the Aztecs had given a name of their own, Tenochtitlan, the sun, named for his golden hair and his fair skin and his bright blue eyes. Pedro de Alvarado, a man whose capacity for violence would shock even the conquistadors. In April 1520, 5 months into the occupation, Cortés received word that changed the calculus entirely. A new Spanish force had landed at Veracruz, not reinforcement, punishment. Governor Diego Velázquez, the man Cortés had defied, the man whose commission Cortés had used and then discarded like scaffolding, had finally responded. He had sent Panfilo de Narváez with 19 ships and 900 men, nearly double Cortés's original force. Narváez carried explicit orders: arrest Cortés for insubordination, strip him of his command, return him to Cuba in chains. If Narváez succeeded, everything Cortés had built, the alliances, the intelligence, the position inside the most powerful city in the Americas, would be lost. The Tlaxcalan alliance would dissolve. The tributary city-states would reassess. The window would close. Cortés made a decision that reveals everything about his character, about the combination of audacity and calculation that made him one of the most dangerous men of his century. He left Tenochtitlan. He took the majority of his soldiers, leaving behind approximately 120 Spaniards under Alvarado's command, marched to the coast, and on the night of May 28th, launched a surprise attack on Narváez's much larger force. It was a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. Cortés's men had smeared the ground around the Spanish camp with animal fat to make footing treacherous. They attacked at night, in rain. Narváez fought back but took a lance to the face that cost him an eye. His men, confused, outnumbered in the dark, demoralized by their commander's fall, surrendered. Then Cortés did something even more remarkable than winning the battle. He turned Narváez's army into his own. He walked among the captured soldiers. He showed them gold. He told them what waited in Tenochtitlan. He promised them shares in wealth beyond their imagination. 900 men who had sailed from Cuba to arrest him woke up the next morning as soldiers in his army. Cortés had doubled his force in a single night. But while he was gone, while he was fighting Narváez on the coast, while he was performing his astonishing act of military judo, he had left Tenochtitlan in the hands of Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was brave. Alvarado was charismatic. Alvarado was, by multiple accounts, one of the most physically impressive Spaniards in the expedition, tall, blonde, athletic. The Aztecs had named him Tenochtitlan, the sun, and the name stuck because it fit. He gleamed. He was also catastrophically, irreversibly brutal. Not brutal in the calculated way Cortés was brutal. Cortés used violence as a tool, deployed it strategically, understood its consequences. Alvarado was brutal the way a fire is brutal, without precision, without strategy, without understanding that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And now, with Cortés gone, with only 120 Spanish soldiers holding the most dangerous position in the Americas, Alvarado was in command. In May 1520, the Aztec religious calendar reached one of its most important festivals, Tlaxcatl, a ceremony honoring Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, one of the supreme deities of the Aztec pantheon. The festival was elaborate, days of preparation, fasting, ritual, culminating in a great public celebration in the ceremonial precinct adjacent to the Templo Mayor. For the festival, the Aztec elite gathered, hundreds of them, possibly thousands, the empire's highest-ranking nobles, warriors, and priests, men who had taken captives in battle, men who had climbed the steps of the temple as victors, the most important, most powerful, most experienced people in the civilization. They assembled in the courtyard. They put on their finest regalia, feathered headdresses, gold armbands, jade lip plugs, cloaks of embroidered cotton. They were unarmed. This was a religious ceremony. They were dancing. Alvarado ordered his men to seal the exits of the courtyard. Then the Spanish attacked. The indigenous accounts of what followed, compiled in the Florentine Codex from the testimony of survivors, recorded in Nahuatl by scribes working with Sahagun, are among the most harrowing documents in the historical record. They describe what happened with a precision that refuses to look away. They attacked all the celebrants, stabbing them, spearing them, striking them with their swords. They attacked some from behind, and these fell instantly to the ground with their entrails hanging out. Some attempted to run away, but their intestines dragged as they ran. They could not escape. Some attempted to force their way out, but the Spaniards murdered them at the doors. The killing went on until the courtyard was carpeted with bodies. Blood ran in rivulets between the paving stones. The feathered headdresses lay scattered in the gore. The drums had stopped. Why Alvarado did this has been debated for 500 years. He may have feared that the gathered nobles were planning an uprising, that the festival was a cover for a coordinated attack on the small Spanish garrison. He may have decided to decapitate the Aztec military and political leadership in a single stroke, eliminating the men most capable of organizing resistance. He may have panicked. He may have wanted the gold ornaments the celebrants were wearing. He may have been driven by a combination of all of these: fear, greed, miscalculation, and the particular kind of cruelty that emerges when frightened men with weapons find themselves surrounded by unarmed people they regard as less than human. The reason does not change the result. Whatever restraint had held Tenochtitlan together for 6 months, whatever fragile, impossible arrangement had kept 300,000 furious people from tearing 120 foreigners apart, it shattered. Completely, irreversibly, in a single afternoon. The Aztec population of Tenochtitlan rose in a fury that made every previous expression of anger look like a whisper. The Spanish garrison was besieged inside the palace of Axayacatl. Warriors swarmed the rooftops of surrounding buildings, hurling stones, javelins, and burning arrows down into the compound. The causeways were sealed. Food was cut off. Water was cut off. Warriors who had been leashed by their emperor's commands, who had bitten their tongues for 6 months because Moctezuma had ordered restraint, were now unleashed, not by their emperor's order, by their emperor's humiliation. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in late June with his reinforced army, over 1,000 Spanish soldiers now, plus Tlaxcalan allies, he did not walk into the city he had left. He walked into a war. If you followed this story to here, you already understand something that most accounts miss. The Aztec Empire wasn't defeated by Spanish military superiority. It wasn't defeated by guns or horses or steel or any single piece of technology. It wasn't defeated by divine providence, no matter what the Spanish told themselves. It was fractured from within, fractured by a tributary system that had made enemies of everyone it touched, fractured by unconquered rivals who had been sharpening their hatred for a century, fractured by an emperor whose extraordinary sophistication operated within a framework that could not stretch far enough to accommodate the thing that had walked through his gates. What comes next is the bloodiest chapter of this story, and it begins with the death of the emperor himself. By late June 1520, the situation inside Tenochtitlan had crossed into a territory beyond diplomacy, beyond negotiation, beyond any of the tools that had governed relations between the Spanish and the Aztecs for the previous 7 months. The Spanish were besieged, over 1,000 of them now, Cortés's original force, Narvaez's recruits, Tlaxcalan allies trapped inside the compound, barricaded in the palace of Axayacatl while the city burned and raged around them. Aztec warriors attacked constantly. From rooftops, javelins and stones rained down into the palace courtyard. From the streets, war cries echoed off the stone walls, a sound the Spanish would remember for the rest of their lives. The causeways were barricaded. No food was getting in. Water supplies were dwindling. Cortés was trapped inside the heart of a city that wanted him dead, and his only remaining card, his only leverage, was the man he had kept as a hostage for 7 months. He played it. Cortés asked Moctezuma to go to the roof of the palace and address his people. Calm them, order them to stand down, remind them that he was still their emperor, still the voice of the gods, still the man whose word carried the weight of the cosmos. Moctezuma went to the rooftop. The accounts of what happened next diverge at the exact moment they matter most, and they have never been reconciled. The Spanish accounts, Cortés's own letters to King Charles, Bernal Díaz's memoir, other conquistador testimonies, tell one version. Moctezuma appeared on the rooftop. He raised his hands. He began to speak, and the crowd below, which had once prostrated itself at the sound of his voice, which had once averted its eyes from his face as if from the sun, that crowd turned on him. Stones flew upward, javelins arced through the air. The man who had been semi-divine was pelted by his own people, people who now saw him as a collaborator, a traitor, a puppet whose strings were visible to everyone. He was struck in the head. He was struck in the arm. He was struck in the leg. He fell. The Spanish carried him inside. He lingered for 3 days. He refused treatment. He refused food. According to the Spanish accounts, he tore the bandages from his wounds, whether from physical injury, from despair, or from the annihilation of everything that gave his life meaning. The priesthood, the cosmic order, the belief that he was the voice of the gods. Moctezuma died. That is the Spanish version. The Aztec accounts say something different. They say the Spanish murdered him, that once Moctezuma was no longer useful as a bargaining chip, once it became clear that his voice had lost all authority over his own people, Cortés ordered him killed, along with several other Aztec nobles being held captive. The bodies, according to these accounts, were stabbed and then thrown from the palace. The Aztec people did not kill their emperor. The Spanish killed their prisoner. We will likely never know which version is true. The Spanish had every reason to blame the Aztecs. The Aztecs had every reason to blame the Spanish. The truth, if a single truth exists, died on that rooftop or inside that palace, in a room no historian will ever enter. What is certain is this. Moctezuma II, Motkuzoma Zakotsin, the angry lord, the younger, the man who had ruled an empire of 25 million people, who had expanded its territory, who had sat behind golden screens and eaten from dishes prepared by hundreds of hands, whose sandals had never touched bare stone, died on or around June 29, 1520. He was approximately 53 years old. He had been emperor for 18 years. He had been a prisoner for 7 months. His empire had less than 14 months to live. With Moctezuma dead, the last pretense of diplomacy died with him. The hostage had no value. The puppet had no audience. The Spanish had nothing left to bargain with except their weapons and their will to survive. Cortés assessed the situation with the cold clarity that was his most dangerous quality. The Spanish could not hold the palace indefinitely. They were running out of food. They were running out of clean water. They were running out of ammunition. And the attacks were intensifying. Each day, more warriors poured into the streets, more missiles rained from the rooftops, more fires burned in the surrounding buildings. If they stayed, they would be overwhelmed, not in weeks, in days. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortés ordered the retreat. The plan was to slip out under cover of darkness. Rain was falling, heavy, steady, the kind of rain that turned the lake surface into a haze of noise and reduced visibility to a few yards. The Spanish would cross the Tlacopan Causeway, the shortest of the 3 causeways, heading west toward the mainland. From there, they would march to Tlaxcala, regroup, rebuild, come back. Before they moved, Cortés opened the treasury. The rooms of the palace of Axiacatl held the gold that had been collected over 7 months of occupation, tribute payments, temple ornaments, gifts from Moctezuma, objects taken from the royal storehouses, bars of gold, discs of gold, jewelry, figurines, plates. Cortés told his men to take what they could carry. He warned them not to take too much. He warned them that weight would slow them down, that the causeway was narrow, that speed was more important than wealth. Many of them did not listen. They stuffed gold bars into their clothing, into their boots, into their packs, into the folds of their armor. Some of them carried so much gold that they could barely walk. The column moved out around midnight, Spanish soldiers in the lead and the rear, Tlaxcalan allies in the middle, horses, a portable wooden bridge constructed hastily meant to span the gaps in the causeway where the Aztecs had removed sections. At first the darkness held. The rain muffled their footsteps. The causeway stretched ahead of them, a narrow ribbon of stone and earth over black water. The city was behind them. The shore was ahead. For a few minutes it seemed like it might work. Then a woman saw them. The accounts say she was drawing water from the lake, or washing clothes, or simply awake in the pre-dawn hours for reasons that history does not record. She looked up. She saw the shadows moving on the causeway. She saw the glint of metal. She screamed. And then the drums began. From the summit of the Templo Mayor, 147 feet above the city, visible from everywhere, the great war drums began to pound. The sound carried across the lake, across the water, into every house and every barracks and every temple in the city. Conch shell trumpets blasted, a sound the Spanish described as the most terrifying thing they had ever heard, a deep, wailing howl that seemed to come from the water itself. Within minutes, the lake was filled with canoes, hundreds of them, thousands of them, warriors paddling hard, weapons raised, closing on the causeway from both sides. More warriors poured onto the causeway from the city end, cutting off retreat. What followed was not a battle, it was a catastrophe. The portable bridge, the one piece of engineering that the entire plan depended on, jammed in the first gap in the causeway. It had been set in place, and the weight of the men and horses crossing it drove it into the mud and stone so firmly that it could not be extracted. The column had one bridge. It was stuck in the first gap. There were 7 more gaps ahead. The column shattered. Men scrambled forward in the darkness, trying to cross gaps that no longer had bridges. Some jumped. Some fell. Some tried to swim in full armor in the cold lake water, in the rain, in the dark, while canoes full of warriors closed in from every direction. Men fell into the water and drowned. Men who had loaded themselves with gold sank like stones, the metal that had brought them to this continent dragging them to the bottom of the lake. Horses screamed and thrashed in the water, legs tangling in the reeds, riders thrown into the darkness. Spanish soldiers and Tlaxcalan allies were pulled from the causeway into canoes, taken alive, saved for sacrifice. Bernal Diaz survived. He crossed the causeway, and he wrote about the sounds, not the sights in the rain and the darkness he could barely see. The sounds, the drums pounding without pause, the conch shells howling, the war cries of thousands of warriors, a roar that came from everywhere at once, the splashing of men falling into the water, the screaming of horses, the voices of men he had marched with for a year, calling out for help in the darkness, calling out names, calling out to God. He could hear them dying. He could not help them. By dawn, the survivors who had made it to the western shore were a shattered, bleeding remnant. Between 600 and 800 Spaniards were dead. Over 1,000 Tlaxcalan allies had been killed. Most of Narvaez's recruits, the men who had joined Cortés only weeks before, promised gold and glory, were gone. Most of the cannons were at the bottom of the lake. Most of the horses were dead or captured. Most of the gold was lost. And there is a famous image, repeated in 100 paintings and 1,000 retellings. Cortés, the man who had burned his ships, who had massacred Caligula, who had seized an emperor in his own palace, sitting beneath a cypress tree on the outskirts of the town of Tlacopan, weeping. Whether he actually wept is unknowable. Whether the tree was a cypress or something else is a detail lost to time. What matters is the meaning. The man who had done everything through will and calculation had reached a moment where will and calculation were not enough. The Spanish called it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. The Aztecs did not give it a special name. For them it was not a sorrow, it was a victory. The foreigners had been driven out. The dead were avenged. The gods were satisfied. For a brief shining moment, the Aztec Empire had won. And now we reach the moment where everything might have been different, the hinge upon which the entire future of a civilization turned. Cortés was in full retreat. His army was broken. His gold was at the bottom of a lake. His cannons were captured. His horses were dead. His reputation for invincibility, the aura that had made cities surrender without a fight, that had brought 200,000 warriors to his side, was shattered. This was the moment. If the Aztecs had pursued with everything they had, if they had mobilized their full military force, not just the garrison of Tenochtitlan, but the armies of the empire, and chased the remnant across the valley of Mexico and into Tlaxcala, and burned Tlaxcala to the ground and killed every last Spaniard and every last Tlaxcalan who had aided them, the story might have ended here. They pursued. They did not stop fighting. At the Battle of Atumba on July 14th, a large Aztec force caught the retreating Spanish in an open plain, ideal terrain for the Aztecs, who fought in large formations and could bring their numerical advantage to bear. The Spanish were exhausted, wounded, demoralized. Many were still bleeding from wounds suffered on the causeway. They had almost no ammunition. Their remaining horses were limping. It should have been the end. But Cortés spotted the Aztec battlefield commander, identifiable by an elaborate feathered standard rising above the formation, a banner that marked the leader's position so that warriors could orient on him in the chaos of battle. Cortés understood, in that instant, something the Aztecs had never considered a vulnerability. The standard was a beacon. It told every warrior where to look for orders. It also told Cortés where to aim. He gathered his remaining horsemen, perhaps 5 or 6 mounted soldiers, all that were left, and led a charge directly at the standard. Through the Aztec formation, through hundreds of warriors, straight at the commander. The commander fell, the standard fell with him. And the Aztec army, following the protocols of a style of warfare that had served them for a century, where the capture or death of the commanding lord signaled the end of engagement, broke off the attack. The Spanish escaped to Tlaxcala. And here is the 6th error, the final missed opportunity. The Aztecs did not follow them, did not pursue into Tlaxcalan territory, did not demand that Tlaxcala surrender the foreigners, did not assemble a coalition of city-states to march on Tlaxcala and finish the job while the Spanish were still bleeding, still broken, still vulnerable. Why not? Because the Aztec Empire had no coalition to assemble. Every surrounding city-state was either neutral, waiting to see which side would win, or actively supporting the Spanish. The tribute system, the system that had built Tenochtitlan's wealth, that had filled its storehouses, that had piled gold in its temples, had left the Aztecs utterly, catastrophically alone. They had no friends. They had no allies. They had only subjects. And subjects, by definition, are people waiting for the chains to break. There was nowhere to turn, no one to call. The empire that had extracted tribute from 400 city-states could not find a single one willing to fight for its survival. And something else had arrived, something that came across the ocean on the ships of Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition, something that may have been carried by a single infected person. Some sources identify him as an African man, enslaved, named Francisco de Eguia, though the identification is uncertain. What is certain is that the pathogen found its way from the coast to the valley of Mexico, from the lowlands to the highlands, from the Spanish camps to the indigenous population. Smallpox. The disease would kill more people in the next 12 months than every battle of the entire conquest combined, more than La Noche Triste, more than Caligula, more than the final siege, more than every sword stroke and cannon blast and cavalry charge put together. And its first victim, its most strategically devastating victim, would be the one man who had proven he could defeat the Spanish in open battle. The Spanish had been driven from Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma was dead. For a brief, bright moment, it looked like the empire might survive. A new emperor had taken the throne, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, the man who had organized the uprising, who had driven the foreigners from the city, who had tasted victory. But the worst was not the armies that would return with their brigantines and their cannons, and their 200,000 Tlaxcalan warriors. The worst was already inside the walls, already moving through the markets, already passing from hand to hand, from breath to breath, from mother to child. Already killing. And no one on either side, not the Aztecs, not the Spanish, not a single human being alive in 1520, understood what it was. To understand what happened next, to truly understand it, not just as a historical event, but as a biological catastrophe without parallel in the recorded history of our species, you need to understand something about immunology, about the invisible architecture of the human body, and about what happens when 10,000 years of separation collapse into a single, lethal moment of contact. In Europe, in Asia, in Africa, across the interconnected landmass that scholars call the Old World, human beings had lived alongside domesticated animals for millennia. Cattle, pigs, chickens, horses, sheep, goats. These animals were the foundation of agriculture, of transportation, of daily life. They were also reservoirs of disease. Pathogens that originated in animal populations jumped to humans. Smallpox likely evolved from a virus carried by cattle. Measles may have crossed from rinderpest in livestock. Influenza circulated between pigs and birds and humans in an endless cycle. Over centuries, over millennia, these diseases swept through Eurasian populations in wave after wave of epidemic. The Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, the Antonine Plague. Millions died. Each epidemic was devastating. But each epidemic also left survivors, and the survivors carried something in their blood. Not immunity in the absolute sense. You could still catch smallpox in 16th century Spain and it could still kill you, but partial resistance. Immune systems that recognized the pathogen, that had been shaped across dozens of generations of exposure to mount a response, to fight back, to give the body a chance. In the Americas, none of this had happened. There were no domesticated cattle in the Western Hemisphere, no pigs, no chickens, no horses, no sheep. The only large domesticated animal in Mesoamerica was the turkey. The only domesticated mammal of significant size in South America was the llama. The disease exchange between animals and humans that had shaped Eurasian immune systems for 10,000 years simply did not occur. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been separated from the Eurasian disease pool since their ancestors crossed the land bridge from Siberia during the last ice age. At least 12,000 years of separation, possibly longer. 12,000 years during which the human populations on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean developed along completely independent immunological trajectories. 12,000 years of isolation. And when smallpox crossed the Atlantic in the body of an infected member of Narvaez's expedition, when it traveled from the coast to the highlands, from the Spanish camps to the indigenous communities, from one person to the next through the simple, unavoidable mechanisms of human contact, it entered a population of millions who had never encountered it. Not once, not in any generation, not in any form. Not even in a weakened, related strain that might have provided some partial cross-protection. Their immune systems did not recognize the virus, could not mount an effective response, had no template, no memory, no framework for fighting something that, in immunological terms, did not exist in their world. The Florentine Codex describes what happened. The words were spoken in Nahuatl by survivors, recorded by scribes, preserved across the centuries in a voice that still carries the weight of incomprehension. There came upon us a great sickness, a general plague. It began in Tepelhuitl. Large bumps spread on people, some were entirely covered. They spread everywhere on the face, the head, the chest. Many died of it. No longer could they walk. They only lay in their beds in their sleeping places. They could not move. They could not stir. They could not change position, nor lie on one side, nor on their stomachs, nor on their backs, and if they did move, they screamed in pain. The case fatality rate for smallpox in a population with no prior exposure can reach 30 to 50%. In some communities, it was higher, not because the virus was more virulent. The virus was the same virus that killed people in Europe. It was higher because of a compounding effect that epidemiologists call social collapse mortality. When a disease strikes a population where everyone is susceptible, where there are no immune individuals to care for the sick, to bring water, to prepare food, to tend the fires, to carry the dead, the death toll multiplies. People die not only from the disease itself but from dehydration, because no one is well enough to bring them water, from starvation, because no one is well enough to cook, from secondary infections in their pustules, because no one is well enough to clean their wounds, from exposure, because no one is well enough to maintain the fires. Everyone is sick at the same time, everyone. In Tenochtitlan, the epidemic struck in September 1520, 3 months after La Noche Triste, and burned through the population with a speed and a thoroughness that the survivors could only describe in the language of divine punishment. The bumps appeared. The fever came. People who had been healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. Families died together in their homes with no one left to carry them out. An estimated 40% of Tenochtitlan's population died in a matter of weeks. 40%. In a city of 300,000, that is 120,000 people, dead, not from swords, not from cannons, not from cavalry charges or siege warfare or any weapon that any army on earth had ever wielded. From a virus they could not see, could not understand, could not fight, and could not flee, because it was already everywhere. After Moctezuma's death, leadership of the Aztec Empire passed to his brother, Cuitlahuac. If Moctezuma was the philosopher, Cuitlahuac was the warrior. He was everything the crisis demanded and everything Moctezuma had failed to be in those final, paralyzed months. Decisive where Moctezuma had hesitated. Aggressive where Moctezuma had accommodated. Clear-eyed where Moctezuma had been clouded by uncertainty and omen. Cuitlahuac was the one who had organized the uprising after the Tenochtitlan massacre. He was the one who had mobilized the warriors of Tenochtitlan. He was the one who had driven the Spanish out during La Noche Triste, inflicted the most devastating defeat the conquistadors would ever suffer in the Americas. He had proven on the causeways and in the streets that the Spanish could be beaten, that they could be broken, that they could die. He became emperor in September 1520 and he moved immediately. He understood the strategic situation with a clarity that bordered on prescience. The Spanish would return. They would bring allies. They would bring new weapons. The window for action was narrow, and every day it grew narrower. He began reorganizing the military, not for the kind of ritualized warfare the Flower Wars had trained warriors for, but for the kind of total, desperate, existential combat the Spanish had introduced. He repaired the causeways, strengthened the defenses, stockpiled weapons, sent emissaries to neighboring city-states, attempting to build the alliance system the empire had never needed before, because before it had ruled through fear. Now it needed to lead through persuasion. Most of the emissaries were turned away, or killed. The tributary states had no interest in saving the empire that had bled them for a century. The message came back, again and again in different forms but with the same meaning: you are on your own. Still, Cuitlahuac prepared. He drilled warriors. He adapted tactics. He studied the Spanish weaknesses that La Noche Triste had exposed, their dependence on horses, their vulnerability on narrow causeways, their inability to fight effectively in the labyrinth of canals and alleys that made up Tenochtitlan's interior. If anyone alive could have saved the Aztec Empire, it was Cuitlahuac. He ruled for 80 days. In December 1520, 3 months after taking the throne, the fever came. Then the pustules. His skin erupted in the same lesions that were killing his people by the tens of thousands. He could not eat. He could not stand. He could not issue orders. He could not lead. Cuitlahuac, the warrior emperor, the man who had driven the Spanish from Tenochtitlan, died of smallpox. He never saw another Spanish soldier. He never fought another battle. The disease that had crossed an ocean in the blood of strangers, strangers from a world he had never known existed, killed him in his own palace, in his own bed, surrounded by priests who could not explain what was happening and healers whose medicines had no effect. He was likely in his mid-40s. He had been emperor for less than 3 months. Smallpox did what 600 Spanish soldiers, 16 horses, and a dozen cannons could not do. It killed the one leader who had demonstrated the ability to defeat the invaders. And it did this silently, invisibly, without any human being on either side of the conflict understanding the mechanism by which it killed. The Spanish believed their victories were evidence of God's favor. The Aztecs believed the plague was punishment from their own gods, or proof that the strangers' gods were more powerful. Both sides reached for divine explanations. Because the real explanation, invisible organisms exploiting immunological vulnerability across 12,000 years of hemispheric separation, was 3 centuries beyond anyone's comprehension. In January 1521, a new emperor was chosen, the third in less than 8 months, the last the Aztec Empire would ever have. Cuauhtémoc, his name meant descending eagle. He was approximately 25 years old, Moctezuma's nephew through one of the former emperor's daughters, a warrior of proven courage and fierce determination, young, unbowed. He inherited a catastrophe. The population of Tenochtitlan had been devastated. The smallpox epidemic, still burning through the city, had killed tens of thousands. Entire families were gone. Entire neighborhoods were empty. The bodies were so numerous they could not all be buried or burned with proper ceremony. Some were pushed into the canals where they bloated and drifted. The water turned foul. The stench hung over the city like a second plague. The military leadership had been gutted. Not by battle, by disease. Many of the empire's finest warriors, its most experienced commanders, its bravest captains, men who had taken prisoners in flower wars, men who had climbed the temple steps as victors, had died not with obsidian blades in their hands but flat on their backs, covered in pustules, too weak to lift a cup of water to their own lips. A generation of military expertise, wiped out by a pathogen no one could name. The political landscape had shifted irreversibly. City-states that might once have been intimidated into loyalty or even persuaded to rally to the empire in its hour of need now saw a dying civilization. The Tlaxcalans and their growing coalition, which now included Texcoco, the second city of the old Triple Alliance, the empire's own former partner turned traitor, smelled blood. And in Tlaxcala, 40 miles to the east, Cortés was doing something unprecedented. He was building ships. 13 brigantines, small armed sailing vessels, each approximately 40 feet long, flat-bottomed for shallow lake operations, equipped with cannon mounts and oar ports. Designed by a Spanish shipwright named Martin Lopez, constructed in Tlaxcala from timber felled in the mountains, using iron fittings salvaged from the scuttled ships at Veracruz, built 40 miles from the nearest body of water. When completed, they would be disassembled. Every plank, every beam, every mast, every fitting would be numbered, taken apart, and carried over the mountains in pieces by 8,000 Tlaxcalan porters, guarded by a column of 20,000 warriors. Carried through mountain passes above 10,000 feet, across rivers, through territory that was still, technically, part of the Aztec Empire, though the empire's grip was loosening by the day. On the shores of Lake Texcoco they would be reassembled, the keels would be laid, the planks would be fitted, the masts would be raised, sails would be sewn, cannons would be mounted. And for the first time in the history of the Valley of Mexico, armed warships would float on the lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan. The island city's greatest defensive advantage, the fact that it sat in the middle of a lake, accessible only by causeways that could be cut and defended, was about to become irrelevant. The causeways could be bypassed. The canoe fleets could be overwhelmed. The aqueducts could be reached from the water and destroyed. An island fortress becomes an island prison the moment your enemy controls the sea. Cuauhtémoc knew the Spanish were coming back. He could see it in the movements of his former tributaries, in the silence of his emissaries, in the steady trickle of city-states switching allegiance. He fortified the causeways. He stockpiled weapons. He drilled his remaining warriors, many of them young, many of them still recovering from smallpox, many of them fighting for the first time. He tried to rally allies. Almost no one came. 400 city-states, a century of tribute paid in blood and treasure, and when the empire needed them most, when existence itself hung in the balance, those 400 city-states either stayed home, watched from a safe distance, or picked up their weapons and marched alongside the Spanish. The tribute system didn't just fund the empire, it built the army that destroyed it. On April 28, 1521, Cortés began his march back to Tenochtitlan. His force had been transformed. In the 10 months since La Noche Triste, 10 months of recovery, recruitment, planning, and construction in Tlaxcala, the broken remnant that had fled the causeways in the rain had become something entirely different. He now had approximately 900 Spanish soldiers, a mix of his original men, the survivors, the ones who had crossed every causeway and climbed every mountain pass since Cuba, Narvaez's recruits who had lived through the Night of Sorrows, and new arrivals from the Caribbean who had heard the stories of gold and come to claim their share. He had 80 horses, 15 cannons, gunpowder, crossbow bolts, steel. But the Spanish were still, by far, the smallest part of the army. Marching with Cortés were over 200,000 indigenous warriors. 200,000. Tlaxcalans, the century-old enemies of the empire who had been waiting for this moment since before any of them were born. Totonacs from the coast, still burning with resentment over years of tribute. Texcocans from Texcoco, the second city of the old Triple Alliance itself, whose internal politics had produced a faction willing to betray the alliance for Spanish support. Calulans, Huixotzincans, Chalcas, Xochimilcans. Peoples from dozens of city-states across central Mexico, all of them united not by love of the Spanish. They did not love the Spanish, would never love the Spanish, but by a single, burning, generational objective: the destruction of Tenochtitlan. This was not a foreign invasion. This was a reckoning, the largest indigenous military coalition in the history of Mesoamerica, aimed at the heart of the empire that had bled them all. And now they had something they had never had before: warships. The 13 brigantines had been carried over the mountains in pieces, on the backs of Tlaxcalan porters, 8,000 men bearing timber and iron and rope through mountain passes, guarded by 20,000 warriors, and reassembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. One of the most extraordinary logistical feats in pre-modern military history. 40-foot vessels, constructed on dry land, disassembled, transported over mountains, and rebuilt on the shores of a lake that had never seen anything larger than a canoe. Sails were raised, cannons were mounted on the decks, Spanish sailors who had crossed the Atlantic manned the tillers. For the first time in the history of the Valley of Mexico, armed warships floated on the waters surrounding Tenochtitlan. The island fortress had become an island prison. The Siege of Tenochtitlan began in late May 1521. It lasted 75 days. It was one of the most brutal episodes of urban warfare in pre-modern history, perhaps in all of history. What happened during those 75 days defies easy narration. It was not a single battle, but an unrelenting, grinding, day-after-day destruction of a city and the people trapped inside it. Cortés's strategy was methodical, patient, and merciless. The brigantines controlled the lake. They swept the surface, destroying canoe traffic, sinking the vessels that had once carried food and water and trade goods to the island. Any canoe that ventured out was run down, rammed, or blasted with cannon fire. The lake that had been Tenochtitlan's lifeline, its highway, its market route, its connection to the farms and fishing grounds that fed 300,000 people, was now a killing field. The aqueduct from Chapultepec, the twin stone channels that carried fresh water 3 miles from the springs on the mainland to the island, was severed, cut, destroyed. The city's primary water supply, the engineering marvel that had sustained the population for generations, was gone. The causeways were assaulted simultaneously from 3 directions. Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies pushed inward along the narrow stone roads, fighting for every yard, while brigantines provided fire support from the water on both flanks. Inside the city, Cuauhtémoc organized a defense that, by any military standard, was extraordinary. The Aztec warriors adapted. They had learned from La Noche Triste and from the months of fighting. They dug pits in the causeway surfaces and covered them with thin layers of stone and plaster, creating traps for the horses. The animals would step on the false surface, break through, and fall into sharpened stakes below. They built barricades across the streets using rubble from demolished buildings. They cut openings in the walls of houses, creating hidden passages through which warriors could move unseen and strike from unexpected angles. They flooded sections of the causeways by breaching canal walls, turning solid ground into waist-deep water where Spanish armor became a death sentence. They attacked from rooftops, hurling stones and javelins and ceramic pots filled with hornets down onto the advancing columns. They launched nighttime raids, slipping through the canals in small canoes, attacking Spanish positions in the darkness, killing sentries, dragging prisoners into the water. They fought in the canals themselves, using their intimate knowledge of the city's waterways to ambush Spanish forces that had no maps and no understanding of the labyrinthine network of channels that threaded through the urban fabric. And they did something that struck terror into the Spanish, in a way that no military tactic could match. They captured Spanish soldiers alive, and they sacrificed them on the Templo Mayor, in full view of the besieging army. Bernal Diaz describes seeing it. From the Spanish positions on the causeways, the summit of the great temple was visible, 147 feet above the city, the twin shrines outlined against the sky. He describes seeing captured Spaniards, men he knew, men he had marched with from Cuba, being forced up the steep steps. He describes seeing them held down across the sacrificial stone. He describes the drums, the fires, the screams carrying across the water. He describes knowing with absolute certainty that every Spanish soldier in the army was seeing the same thing, and that every one of them understood, if they were captured, that was what waited for them. The psychological warfare was devastating, but it could not overcome the mathematics. Tenochtitlan was surrounded. No food was getting in. The fresh water was gone. The aqueduct was destroyed and the lake water was brackish, undrinkable. Disease continued its work, killing indiscriminately, killing warriors and civilians and children with equal efficiency. And every day the perimeter shrank. Cortés developed a tactic of systematic demolition that was as effective as it was heartbreaking. Rather than fight through the narrow streets, where the Aztecs had every advantage, where ambushes waited behind every corner, where the rooftops rained death, the Spanish and their allies tore down the buildings as they advanced. They demolished houses. They knocked down walls. They filled in the canals with the rubble, the carved stone, the painted plaster, the beams that had been someone's home, someone's workshop, someone's temple, and created flat, open fields of fire where their cannons and crossbows could be used effectively, and where the Aztec advantage of urban terrain was neutralized. Block by block, they erased the city as they conquered it. The defenders were pushed back. Day by day, the habitable perimeter contracted. The northern district of Tenochtitlan, home to the great marketplace where 60,000 people had once traded, became the last stronghold. Into this shrinking space the surviving population compressed: warriors, civilians, the elderly, children, the sick, the wounded, the dying, all of them crowded together in a space that grew smaller every day, with no food, no clean water, and no hope of relief. And the dying accelerated, not from combat alone, not from disease alone, from hunger. The Aztec accounts of the final weeks of the siege, accounts recorded in Nahuatl by survivors, compiled in the years after the fall, are among the most difficult passages in the historical literature of the Americas. They describe a starvation so complete, so absolute, that it stripped away everything except the biological imperative to survive. There was nothing more to do. The enemy was too strong. Our men were too weak from hunger and sickness. We could not eat the salt and grass and lizards which were our only food. They ate insects. They ate leather, the straps of shields, the bindings of sandals, anything that had once been animal skin. They chewed on wood. They ate the plaster from the walls. They ate the grass that grew between the paving stones. They drank brackish water scooped from the lake, water contaminated with sewage and decomposing bodies, and the dysentery that followed killed almost as efficiently as the starvation. The corpses of the dead filled the canals. There was no one left with the strength to bury them, no wood left to burn them, no space left to lay them out. The bodies lay in the streets. They floated in the waterways. They were stacked against walls. The water of the canals, the same canals that had once carried flowers and trade goods and families in painted canoes, turned dark and thick. The smell was so overwhelming that even the attacking soldiers, men who had spent months killing, men who had been hardened by every horror the conquest could produce, recoiled. Cortés himself, in a letter to Emperor Charles V, wrote, "The people of the city had to walk upon their dead, while others swam or drowned in the waters of that wide lake. So great was their suffering that it was beyond our understanding how they could endure it." Beyond our understanding. The man who had ordered the siege, who had cut the water supply, who had demolished the buildings, who had commanded the blockade that was starving the city. Even he could not comprehend what he had done. On August 13th, 1521, it ended. 75 days, 2.5 months of continuous assault, starvation, disease, and street-by-street destruction. Cuauhtémoc had refused to surrender. Through every phase of the siege, through the loss of the causeways, through the destruction of the aqueduct, through the demolition of the city block by block, through the starvation and the disease and the daily shrinking of the perimeter, he had held. He had fought. He had organized counterattacks and night raids and ambushes with warriors who were half-starved and bleeding and fighting with weapons scavenged from the rubble. He was 25 years old. He had been emperor for 7 months. He had never known a day of his reign that was not consumed by war. On the final day, with the last defenders cornered in the marketplace of Tenochtitlan, the same marketplace where 60,000 people had once traded in obsidian and jade and cacao and vanilla and quetzal feathers, with the canals choked with corpses, and the streets impassable with rubble, and the stench of death so thick that men wrapped cloth around their faces to breathe, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape. He boarded a canoe. With a small group of warriors and nobles, he pushed out onto the lake, trying to slip through the cordon of brigantines heading where? There was nowhere to go. Every city around the lake had surrendered or allied with the Spanish. There was no safe harbor, no refuge, no ally waiting on the far shore. Perhaps he was trying to reach the mountains. Perhaps he intended to organize guerrilla resistance from the highlands. Perhaps he simply could not bear to be taken in the marketplace, surrounded by the dead, in the ruins of the city he had sworn to protect. A Spanish brigantine spotted the canoe. It closed the distance quickly, oars and sails against paddles. The brigantine pulled alongside. Spanish soldiers boarded. Cuauhtémoc was captured. He was brought before Cortés, the last emperor of the Aztec Empire, standing before the man who had destroyed it. The accounts describe Cuauhtémoc as emaciated, sick, his face gaunt, his body wasted by months of inadequate food and the relentless physical toll of commanding a defense while starving. He had watched his city die around him, building by building, block by block, person by person, for 75 days. He spoke, and his words survived, carried across 5 centuries by people who understood that some things must not be forgotten. I have done everything in my power to defend my kingdom and free it from your hands. Since my fortune has not been good, take my life. This would be right, and with this you will finish the Mexican kingdom, for you have already destroyed my city and killed my people. Take my life, 3 words, spoken by a 25-year-old man standing in the ruins of a civilization, not begging, not negotiating, stating a fact. You have destroyed everything. Finish it. Cortés did not kill him, not that day. Cuauhtémoc was more useful alive, a captive emperor, a symbol of submission, proof that the conquest was complete. He was kept prisoner for 4 more years, paraded before indigenous communities as evidence that resistance was futile. In 1525, during a grueling overland expedition to Honduras, Cortés accused Cuauhtémoc of plotting a rebellion. The evidence was thin. The trial was a formality. Cuauhtémoc was hanged from a ceiba tree in the jungle, far from the lake, far from the mountains, far from the ruins of the city he had defended to the last stone. He was approximately 29 years old. Today, Cuauhtémoc is a national hero of Mexico. His image appears on the country's currency. Streets and neighborhoods and monuments bear his name. He is remembered not as the man who lost, but as the man who refused to stop fighting. The descending eagle. The man who said, "Take my life," and meant it. As for the city that Bernal Diaz had called an enchanted vision, the city that had been larger than London, more complex than Seville, more beautiful than anything its conquerors had ever imagined. Estimates of the dead from the siege alone range from 100,000 to 240,000 people. Tenochtitlan was in ruins. The canals were choked with corpses. The temples were shattered. The gardens were ash. The aviaries were silent. The marketplace where 60,000 people had traded was a field of rubble and bone. Cortés ordered what remained demolished. Forced indigenous laborers, many of them survivors of the siege, many of them from the very city being destroyed, to tear down the standing walls, clear the rubble, fill in the canals with debris, and level the ground. And on the ruins of the greatest city in the Americas, on top of the bones, on top of the temple foundations, on top of the filled-in canals, he built a new city. He called it Mexico City. It stands there still, 22 million people, built on a foundation of the dead. If this were only a story about a military conquest, it would end here. August 13, 1521, the fall of Tenochtitlan, the capture of Cuauhtémoc, the end of the Aztec Empire. A tragedy, certainly, a destruction of something irreplaceable undeniably, but a tragedy with a defined endpoint, a battle lost, a city fallen, an empire ended. But this story does not end on August 13th. Because the real catastrophe, the catastrophe that dwarfs the military conquest the way the ocean dwarfs a puddle, had barely begun. The siege of Tenochtitlan killed perhaps 200,000 people, a staggering number, a number that, in any other context, would define the event as one of history's great horrors. What followed killed millions. The first smallpox epidemic, the one that killed Cuauhtémoc, the one that swept through Tenochtitlan before the siege even began, did not stay in the capital. It radiated outward from central Mexico in concentric waves, following trade routes, following rivers, following the invisible pathways of human contact. Village to village, market to market, family to family. It moved through the highlands and down into the coastal lowlands. It crossed mountain ranges. It penetrated jungles. By the time it burned itself out, around 1527, it had killed an estimated 5 to 8 million people. 5 to 8 million. Communities that had never seen a Spanish soldier were destroyed. Villages in the Sierra Madre, settlements in the Oaxacan highlands, fishing communities on the Pacific coast, towns in the jungles of the Yucatan that the Spanish would not reach for another decade. The disease arrived first. It always arrived first. It traveled faster than any army, faster than any horse, faster than any message runner. It needed nothing but human proximity to spread, and human proximity was the one thing no civilization could eliminate. And it was only the first wave. After smallpox came measles, an epidemic that swept central Mexico in the 1530s, killing an estimated 2 million more. A population already weakened by smallpox, already grieving, already fractured, struck again by a pathogen against which they had, again, no immunity. After measles came typhus. After typhus, influenza. After influenza, mumps. Each new disease struck a population already devastated by the last. Each wave found fewer people to kill, but those who remained were more vulnerable, more malnourished, more traumatized, more crowded into smaller spaces as the colonial system consolidated indigenous populations into congregations. Centralized settlements designed to facilitate conversion and labor extraction, which also, catastrophically, facilitated the spread of disease. And then came the worst. In 1545, 24 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, a disease the Aztec survivors called coccolistli struck central Mexico. Coccolistli. The word means pestilence in Nahuatl, a general term, a word for something so terrible that specificity failed. For centuries, no one knew exactly what coccolistli was. The symptoms described in colonial records did not precisely match any known European disease. High fever, severe headache, vertigo, dark blood-tinged urine, bleeding from the nose, the mouth, the eyes, intense abdominal pain, hard, painful nodules behind the ears, and death, rapid death, often within 3 to 4 days of the first symptoms. In 2018, a team of researchers led by scientists from the Max Planck Institute published a study in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. They had extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of coccolistli victims buried in a mass grave at the Mixtec site of Tepezcatliucanda in Oaxaca. They identified the likely pathogen: Salmonella enterica, subspecies Enterica cerevisiae, a bacterium that causes enteric fever, a disease related to typhoid, a pathogen that likely arrived from Europe or Africa in the guts of colonizers or their livestock, and that found in the malnourished, immunologically devastated indigenous population of Mexico, a host population of unimaginable vulnerability. The 1540-5154 coccolistli epidemic killed an estimated 5 to 15 million people. Pause on that number. The low estimate, 5 million, is roughly equivalent to the entire population of Ireland at the time of the Great Famine. The high estimate, 15 million, exceeds the death toll of the First World War for the entire British Empire, all combatant nations, 4 years of industrialized slaughter on the Western Front, 15 million. That is the estimated toll of a single epidemic in colonial Mexico, lasting 3 years. Then it came back. The second coccolistli epidemic, 1576 to 1580, killed another 2 to 2.5 million. By the year 1600, 81 years after Cortés landed on the coast at Veracruz with his 11 ships, the indigenous population of central Mexico had fallen from approximately 25 million to approximately 1 to 2 million, a reduction of 90 to 96%. In a single human lifetime, 81 years, a person born in 1519, the year Cortés arrived, could have been alive in 1600, could have been 81 years old, sitting in a village that had once held 5,000 people and now held 200, remembering a world that no one else alive had ever seen. Numbers this large become abstractions, 24 million dead. The words sit on the page and the mind slides off them like water off stone. The human brain did not evolve to process suffering at this scale. We can mourn one death. We can grieve 100. We can be horrified by 1,000. 24 million is not a number the heart can hold. So let me try to make it mean something. In modern terms, imagine the United States, 330 million people. Now imagine that 80 years from now, within the lifetime of a child born today, the population is 13 million. Fewer people than currently live in the state of Pennsylvania. Every city emptied. Every town a graveyard. 96 out of every 100 people you have ever known, ever met, ever passed on the street, dead. That is what happened to central Mexico between 1519 and 1600. And every single one of those 24 million people had a name, had a face, had a family, had a language in which they dreamed and argued and sang their children to sleep. There were women who wove cotton cloth with patterns their grandmothers had taught them, designs passed down through generations, encoded with meaning, each motif carrying stories about the family, the village, the gods. Patterns that no living person can reproduce today, because the last woman who knew them died of coccolessly in 1548 with blood running from her eyes, and she had no daughter left alive to teach. There were men who understood the movements of Venus and Mars with a precision that European astronomers would not achieve for another century, who could predict eclipses, who had developed calendar systems of extraordinary mathematical sophistication, men whose knowledge was stored not in books, or not in books that survived the burning, but in oral tradition, carried in the memories of priests and teachers who died before they could pass it on. There were healers who knew the properties of hundreds of plants, who could set bones, treat infections, manage pain with herbal compounds whose compositions are now lost. Healers who died of diseases their medicine had no framework to understand. There were children, millions of children, children who had never heard of tribute or flower wars or the Templo Mayor, children who lived in farming villages in the mountains, who helped their parents tend the maize, who chased dogs through the streets, who fell asleep listening to stories about the old days and the gods and the creation of the world. The diseases did not distinguish between warriors and children, between priests and farmers, between the guilty and the innocent, if guilt even applies to a population that was, in every meaningful sense, the victim. The Nahuatl lament speaks for all of them, in words of devastating simplicity, words that need no elaboration, no scholarly analysis, no narrative framing, words that say everything. Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls, for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. This is not a poem about military defeat. This is not a lament for a fallen empire. This is a poem about the end of a world. The dying was not the end of the destruction. After the bodies came something that, in its own way, was equally devastating. The burning of memory. Spanish priests arrived in central Mexico in waves during the 1520s and 1530s, Franciscans first, then Dominicans, then Augustinians, carrying with them the absolute conviction that the indigenous religions were the work of the devil, and that the salvation of indigenous souls required the complete eradication of indigenous belief. They began by collecting the codices. The Aztec codices were painted books made of bark paper or deerskin, folded in accordion pleats, covered on both sides with pictographic writing and painted illustrations in vivid color. They contain the empire's history, its astronomical observations, its calendrical calculations, its religious rituals, its genealogies, its medical knowledge, its legal codes, its poetry, its maps. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, preserved in a writing system that combined pictographs, ideographs, and phonetic elements, a system as sophisticated as any in the ancient world, though different in structure from alphabetic writing. The priests collected them and burned them. In the Yucatan, Bishop Diego de Landa organized the most notorious destruction. He gathered thousands of Maya manuscripts, the accumulated intellectual heritage of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in pre-Columbian America, and burned them in a public ceremony in the town of Mani in July 1562. He later wrote about it, with no apparent awareness of what he had done. We found a large number of books, and as they contained nothing in which there were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which the Indians regretted to an amazing degree and caused them much affliction. Which the Indians regretted to an amazing degree. Yes, they regretted it. They regretted watching centuries of their civilization's knowledge turn to ash in front of them, while a man in a cassock told them it was for their own good. Of the thousands of pre-Columbian codices that once existed across Mesoamerica, approximately 15 survive today. 15. Some because they were sent to Europe as curiosities before the burning orders took full effect. Some because they were hidden by indigenous communities at enormous personal risk. Some because they fell through cracks in the machinery of destruction. Everything else is ash. But the codices were only the beginning. Indigenous languages were suppressed. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire, spoken by millions, a language of extraordinary expressiveness and beauty, was banned from official use. Children were taken from their families and placed in mission schools where they were forbidden to speak their parents' tongue. A language that had names for flowers, for stars, for the precise quality of light on water at different times of day. A language that could express philosophical concepts that Spanish could not, was treated as an obstacle to salvation. Religious practices were criminalized. Temples were not just damaged in war, they were systematically dismantled, stone by stone, and the materials used to build Catholic churches. In many cases, the churches were built directly on top of the temple foundations. The Cathedral of Mexico City sits on top of the Templo Mayor. The Church of Our Lady of Remedies sits on top of the Great Pyramid of Cholula, a deliberate architecture of replacement. One god literally stacked on top of another. Names were erased. Millions of people were baptized with Spanish Christian names. Their birth names, the names their parents had chosen based on the day of the Aztec calendar, names that carried cosmological significance that connected the individual to the cycle of creation, were replaced with Pedro, Maria, Juan, Isabel, names that meant nothing in their language, names that severed them from their own past. Medical knowledge was lost. The Aztecs had a sophisticated pharmacopoeia, hundreds of plants identified for specific therapeutic uses, surgical techniques for treating wounds and fractures, herbal preparations for pain management. The Badianus manuscript, compiled in 1552 by an Aztec physician named Martin de la Cruz and translated into Latin by Juan Badiano, records some of this knowledge: remedies for fatigue, for anxiety, for infections, for kidney stones. It is the first medical text written in the Americas. It survives only because it was sent to Spain as a gift. The vast majority of Aztec medical knowledge was not written down. It existed in oral tradition, carried by healers, by midwives, by herbalists who had learned from their mothers and grandmothers. The diseases killed the healers. The conquest killed the tradition. And yet, not everything was erased. Not everything was burned. Not everything was lost. The Nahuatl language survived. Despite centuries of suppression, despite mission schools and colonial policy and the relentless pressure to assimilate, the language endured. Today, approximately 1.7 million people in Mexico still speak Nahuatl. In the mountains of Puebla and Veracruz, in the valleys of Guerrero, in neighborhoods of Mexico City itself, the language of Moctezuma is still a living tongue, still spoken by mothers to children, still used in markets and ceremonies and the daily fabric of life. Not a museum piece, a living language. Some codices survived, hidden by indigenous communities. smuggled to Europe, or created in the years immediately after the conquest by scribes who understood with desperate urgency that what they knew was about to disappear. The Codex Mendoza, the Codex Bourbonicus, and the Florentine Codex, that extraordinary 12-volume compilation produced by Bernardino de Sahagún, working with indigenous informants over 4 decades, recording in Nahuatl and Spanish the full breadth of Aztec culture. Their gods, their festivals, their medicine, their natural history, their history of the conquest in their own words and from their own perspective. The Florentine Codex exists because one Spanish friar, one man, in a sea of men who were burning, understood that destruction was not the same as salvation, that knowing a people's culture was different from destroying it, that something of value was being lost, and that it was worth the labor of a lifetime to preserve what he could. He was not absolved of complicity. He was part of the colonial project, but the books survive because of him. That matters. Cultural practices survived in hybrid form. The Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, blends Catholic All Saints' Day with pre-Columbian traditions of honoring the departed that stretch back thousands of years. Skulls made of sugar, altars laden with marigolds and the favorite foods of the dead. The belief that on certain nights, the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin, and those we have lost return to sit with us. It is practiced today by millions of Mexicans. The old ways did not disappear. They adapted. They put on new clothes. They hid inside the forms the colonizers imposed and kept breathing. And the words survived, embedded in languages spoken around the world. Words so common, so thoroughly absorbed into daily speech, that most people who use them have no idea they are speaking the language of the Aztecs. Chocolate from the Nahuatl Zacatl, tomato from Tometl, avocado from Ahuecatl, coyote from Coyotl, chili from Chile. Every time you say these words, every time you order a chocolate, slice an avocado, add a tomato to a salad, you are speaking Nahuatl. You are carrying in your mouth a fragment of a civilization that someone tried to erase. Perhaps the most remarkable survival is physical. Mexico City, a metropolis of 22 million people, one of the largest cities on Earth, is built directly on top of Tenochtitlan. Not near it, not beside it, on top of it. The colonial city was constructed on the ruins of the Aztec capital, using the same stones, filling the same canals, building over the same foundations. And the past keeps surfacing. Every major construction project in the historic center uncovers Aztec artifacts. Dig a foundation and you find a carved serpent head. Lay a water pipe and you break through the floor of a temple. In 1978, electrical workers digging a trench near the Zocalo, the city's central plaza, the heart of modern Mexico City, struck a massive carved stone 8 feet beneath the surface. It was a representation of the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui, dismembered, depicted at the base of a temple where mythology said she had been thrown by her brother Huitzilopochtli after he killed her at the moment of his birth. The discovery triggered a full archaeological excavation. Over the following decades, the site yielded the remains of the Templo Mayor itself, the Great Temple, the sacred center of the Aztec universe, buried for 457 years beneath the colonial city. Today, you can visit the site, walk among the excavated foundations, see the stone serpent heads and the carved altars and the offerings of jade and shell and obsidian that were placed there 500 years ago by people whose names we will never know, and look up from the ruins and see the Cathedral of Mexico City looming directly adjacent, built from the stones of the temple it replaced. The past is not gone. It is beneath the pavement, beneath the churches, beneath the foundations of a modern city, waiting to be remembered. So, the question this story has been building toward since the first frame: who bears responsibility for 24 million dead? The surface answer is simple and satisfying and not entirely wrong. Hernán Cortés, the Spanish, colonialism, greed, religious fanaticism, the insatiable European hunger for gold and territory, and the conversion of souls by force if persuasion failed. And those answers are not wrong. The Spanish came uninvited. They killed. They enslaved. They burned the books and demolished the temples and stole the gold and imposed a system of forced labor, the encomienda, that worked millions to death in mines and on plantations. They bear responsibility. That responsibility should not be softened, qualified, or excused. But the deeper answer is more uncomfortable, because it requires acknowledging that the Aztec Empire helped build the weapon that destroyed it. The tribute system, 400 city-states paying in blood and treasure for a century, nursing a resentment so deep and so universal that when the opportunity for revenge appeared, 200,000 warriors materialized almost overnight. The empire's wealth was built on extraction, and the cost of that extraction was loyalty, the one resource no amount of gold or feathered costumes could buy back. The Flower Wars, a century of ritualized combat against Tlaxcala that kept an enemy perpetually hostile but never conquered, never absorbed, never neutralized, leaving in place a 2-day march from the capital, a military force of tens of thousands that had spent 100 years learning how to fight Aztecs and dreaming of the day they could fight to destroy them. The decision not to annihilate the Spanish at the coast, when 600 men landed with no reinforcement and no retreat, when they could have been overwhelmed by sheer numbers before they built a single alliance, the empire's leadership chose to observe, to wait, to gather more information. A reasonable response to every previous crisis, a fatal response to this one. The decision to let the Spanish into Tenochtitlan, to open the gates of an island fortress and allow the enemy inside. The failure to pursue the Spanish to destruction after La Noche Triste, to finish the job when the enemy was broken, bleeding, and fleeing. Each of these decisions made sense within the Aztec worldview. The tribute system built wealth and power. The Flower Wars served religious and military purposes. Caution toward unknown strangers was diplomatically sound. Hospitality was culturally mandated. And pursuit after La Noche Triste was complicated by the simple fact that the empire had no allies willing to help. Every decision was rational. Every decision was understandable. And every decision was a step toward annihilation. Because the Spanish did not operate within the Aztec worldview, they did not fight to capture prisoners. They did not seek ritualized warfare. They did not respect diplomatic conventions they had not agreed to. They did not share the same gods, the same assumptions, the same definition of what victory meant. The Aztecs were playing a game whose rules they understood perfectly. The Spanish were playing a different game entirely, and the Aztecs could not see the difference until it was too late. And then there were the diseases, the factor that belonged to no game at all, that operated outside every framework, Spanish, Aztec, Christian, pagan, that did not care about empires or alliances or gold or gods. No one sent the smallpox deliberately. No one understood the mechanism. No one, not Cortés, not Moctezuma, not a single physician or priest or general on either side, had any concept of germ theory, of immunological vulnerability, of what happens when 12,000 years of pathogenic separation collapse into a single moment of contact. The Spanish believed their victories were proof of God's favor. The Aztecs believed the plagues were punishment from their own gods, or evidence that the strangers' gods were stronger. Both sides reached for the divine because the real explanation was 300 years beyond anyone's comprehension. 24 million people died because of a gap in human knowledge that no one alive in the 16th century could have filled. The Aztecs believed they were sustaining the universe through sacrifice. They believed that without the blood offerings, the sun would not rise, the rain would not fall. The fifth age of the world would end in darkness and earthquakes and the destruction of everything that existed. They could not have known, could not have conceived, even in their most apocalyptic visions, that the real threat to their world was not cosmic, not divine, not sent by angry gods or avenged by neglected ones. It was microscopic, an enemy that could not be fought with obsidian blades, could not be propitiated with offerings, could not be understood through omens or interpreted through dreams or turned back by sorcerers. By the time the first pustules appeared on the first body in Tenochtitlan, the war was already over. The military conquest, Cortés and his allies, the siege, the causeways, the brigantines, that was the spectacle, the visible drama, the story that would be told and retold for centuries. The disease was the verdict. This is what makes the fall of the Aztec Empire not merely a tragedy of conquest, one civilization destroying another for territory and gold, but a tragedy of collision. Two worlds that had developed in complete isolation for 12,000 years, meeting in a single catastrophic instant. One world had steel and horses and smallpox. The other had obsidian and canoes and no immunity. The outcome was not inevitable. It was not destiny. It was not divine will on either side. It was not punishment for sin or reward for faith. It was not proof that one civilization was superior to the other. It was biology and politics and the accumulated weight of choices made by human beings who could not see where those choices would lead. Tenochtitlan did not fall because the Aztecs were weak. It did not fall because their civilization was inferior, or their gods were false, or their courage was lacking. It fell because the systems that made them strong, the tribute, the wars, the religious certainty, the splendid isolation, also made them brittle, powerful but inflexible, wealthy but hated, sophisticated but unable to comprehend a threat that existed entirely outside their framework for understanding the world. And when the shock came, a shock that no civilization on Earth could have anticipated, that no preparation could have mitigated, that no amount of military courage or political wisdom could have averted, there was no flexibility left, no margin, no room to bend. They broke. The city that Bernal Diaz called an enchanted vision, the city that was larger than London, more sophisticated than Seville, more beautiful than anything its conquerors had ever seen or would ever build, was demolished. Its stones were stacked into churches. Its canals were filled with rubble. Its name was erased from the maps and replaced with the name of the colony that consumed it. But the lake is still there, beneath the asphalt. You can feel it when the earth shakes. Mexico City sits on ancient lakebed clay, and during earthquakes the ground liquefies. Buildings tilt, streets ripple. The lake reminds the city that it has not been conquered, only covered. The ruins are still there, beneath the cathedral, beneath the Zocalo, beneath 22 million lives lived on top of 24 million deaths. The language is still there, in the mouths of 1.7 million speakers, in the words for chocolate and tomato and avocado that have traveled around the world. And the memory is still there, in a poem written by someone whose name we will never know, in a language that survived against all odds, in words that crossed 500 years to reach this moment. We have pounded our hands in despair against the adobe walls, for our inheritance, our city, is lost and dead. It is lost, but it is not forgotten. And perhaps, in the telling, in the listening, in the refusal to let 24 million people become a footnote, perhaps that is the only victory left to claim. Thank you for staying until the end. This was a difficult one to tell, and I suspect if you've made it this far, it was a difficult one to hear. I have a question for you, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer. The Aztec tribute system created the allies that destroyed the empire. That is the central strategic fact of this story. Without the resentment generated by a century of extraction, Cortés would have had no indigenous allies, no 200,000 warriors, no coalition of city-states willing to fight alongside a few hundred foreigners against the most powerful military force in the Americas. But that same tribute system built the civilization. Without it, there is no great temple, no marketplace of 60,000, no floating gardens, no zoo, no aviary, no botanical gardens, no astronomical knowledge, no poetry, no painted codices, no Tenochtitlan. The system that made the empire magnificent was the same system that made it hated. The strength and the weakness were the same thing. So here's my question. Is there any way an empire can maintain power without planting the seeds of its own destruction? Or is the very act of building an empire, of extracting wealth, of demanding submission, of imposing order through force, also, always, inevitably, the act of building the weapon that tears it down? What modern parallels do you see? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, the next one is going to haunt you. The same year Tenochtitlan fell, 1521, smallpox did something that no one in central Mexico could have known about. It traveled, not westward, not northward, but south, 3,000 miles south, down trade routes the Spanish had never seen, through communities they had never contacted, across the Isthmus of Panama into South America and up into the Andes Mountains. There, at an altitude of over 11,000 feet, it found the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, stretching 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, governing 12 million people with a sophistication that rivaled anything in Europe. And it killed the emperor, Huayna Capac, the supreme ruler of the Inca world, killed him before a single Spanish soldier set foot in Peru, before any Spaniard had even seen the Andes. His death triggered a civil war between his sons, Atahualpa and Huascar, that split the empire in half. Armies fought armies. Cities burned. Tens of thousands died in battles that had nothing to do with Spain and everything to do with the succession crisis caused by a pathogen that had traveled faster than the men who carried it. And by the time a Spanish soldier named Francisco Pizarro finally arrived in Peru in 1532, the Inca Empire was already bleeding, already fractured, already weakened by years of civil war caused by a disease that had arrived a decade before him. Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa with 168 men, against an army of 80,000. Not because of Spanish superiority, because the disease traveled faster than the conquerors, and it had been killing for years before Pizarro ever set foot on Inca soil. That's next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this is what this channel does. The hidden causes behind the catastrophes everyone thinks they know, the decisions that seemed reasonable until they weren't, the stories behind the stories, the human beings behind the numbers. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.